Thank you so much. This is really exciting. I'm really happy that you're here. Let's get into the conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Roy Wood Jr., an American comedian and actor, once said, "We are all Americans, but we live in different America." That talks
Yeah.
about diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a true statement. And it's one that it took me quite some time to realize in my life because in my journey, I grew up in a very small town in Eastern North Carolina. And as I was growing up, I realized a lot of the people that I was around looked like me and in some ways thought like I did, right? There was this kind of connection in this small town ideals of who we are and how we do things. And as I began to branch out and travel more outside of my hometown, I began to realize, wait a second, there's this whole world outside of where I grew up, and there's this whole group of people that are different than I am, and different isn't bad. And as I leaned into that and started having conversations with people across difference, I started to understand that very statement that we do live in two Americas. We want to claim, I did that everything's fine. We're as I was growing up, it's like we're in the 90s now, and we're past all the stories of racism and all the things that I heard my parents talk about in the 50s and the 60s and how they grew up. And like we're beyond that as a society. But the more and more I heard stories, the more I realized that just wasn't true. We wanted to be, but there were real situations that caused us not to be. I think about one of the first conversations I ever had with a friend, and he and I both have children about the same age. And he made the comment that he had to think about the name that he gave his child because he didn't want them to be perceived in a way that would negatively impact them. So I asked more questions. I was like, tell me more about that. What do you mean? Because that never crossed my mind, right? I named my kids and I didn't hesitate around the name I chose, but because of his ethnic background, he knew that an ethnic sounding name was going to come with some challenges for them. So just that hesitation of how do I name my child? Or when I get pulled over and, I think you mentioned that I did a TED talk and I tell this story during the TED talk, but if I ever get pulled over by the police, and I did quite a bit in my teenage years for speeding, I had a heavy foot. I never thought twice about that encounter being one that could be life ending or life changing. And I talk to friends who look different than I do, and they say they hesitate every time they see the lights come on behind them. And it's just a different America that we live in. So I would say, yeah, I think that's a very accurate statement. And the work that I do in organizations and with my family and the people that I interact with is to help people realize that, because it's easy to get in a bubble and condition yourself to say, oh, everything's fine on the outside of this bubble. But if we lean into curiosity and lean into exposure of others, I think we can make a difference.
Good, good, good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, this is a good way to start the conversation. Agreeing that we're all Americans, but we live in different America. That's a good way to start the conversation. But you mentioned something very interesting now, talking about the 1990s and 1950s and 60s, which will always make me to think about the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion have changed over time. So the
Yeah.
question is, based on your experience or how much you can recall with your parents' experience, and maybe one or two things that they told you in the 60s and things like that, and also what you actually experienced in the 90s versus what we
Yeah.
have going on now.
Yeah.
What would you think have changed over time?
Yeah. I think that's an interesting thought that it's changed over time. I would say the concepts of the words, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, those haven't changed. I think the willingness to have the discussion is what is starting to change. And I think over time, I remember growing up and hearing stories of my dad who grew up in southern Georgia on a farm and, the segregation that was taking place. And he remembers the first time he brought a friend home who looked different than him, and his parents were like, that person can't come in our house, right? So the drasticness of that story versus when I was growing up, I had friends of color, not many because of the hometown I was in, but I did, and that they were welcomed, and it wasn't anything. It was this. It shifted from we can't have them around to we don't see color. right? That was kind of the story I was told growing up. And then as I aged and began to have my own experiences in the world, I saw the impact of that statement. We don't see color. So we moved from kind of this cultural, um, you know, negative impact to where we're actively pushing against people who are different than us to what I would say is this cultural blindness of where we understand that there's cultural difference and we understand that there's ethnic difference. However, can't we all just get along? Can't we all assimilate and become American people? Was kind of the mentality in the 90s. And, as I grew up, and thankfully my parents created this environment for me where, treat people with love and empathy and care. And as I figured out what that meant for me as I aged and stepped out into the world, I realized even some of the unwritten rules of how we were supposed to operate in our society as I was growing up, those need to be challenged, right? This idea of I don't see color. That has an impact because I had a friend tell me one time, Jeremy, if you're saying you don't see color, then you don't see me. You're discounting my experience because you're discounting who I am. So that challenged me to think differently and say, how can I embrace the differences that we have? Not only recognize that they are there, but embrace them and allow people to truly step into and be who they are in all aspects of their life.
Wow, wow. This is excellent. Talking about embracing differences. I mean, part of what I don't understand is generally as humans, we tend to be more comfortable to be around somebody that looks like us, right? And it feels like when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's even exaggerated. Right? You have conversations around the fact that, well, when when you see somebody who is a white policeman and when they see a black person on the street, there have been incidents where people say, well, the police get a little bit uncomfortable when seeing a black person. And so, what is it about the black color that tends to terrify? I don't understand.
Yeah, I think it's you said it right. We are naturally drawn towards people who look like us, right? And visibly skin color is one of the things that I can say, oh, you look like me. So we're connected in this moment. But what we don't realize is the skin color has really no meaning other than a visible difference. The way you think, the way you believe, the way you interact with others, I don't know that until I engage in conversation with you. And if we allow ourselves to operate in this kind of threat mentality where we're, driven by our limbic system. So we're getting to kind of the neuroscience here of how our brains are wired. If we're driven by the limbic system, we're going to be in that fight or flight mentality, and everything is seen as a threat. And if it's different than what I am used to, I'm going to actively disengage with it. But if I can create this belief or behavior system within myself that when I notice difference, instead of being driven by the limbic system, I can slow down, choose to respond differently, and approach it as an opportunity, then I get the chance to say, visibly, Tolu, there's differences between you and I. But even as we were preparing for this call this morning, we were recognizing some of the similarities, right?
Yes.
And how do we lean into those similarities? How do I say, oh, well, we're both of the millennial generation. We both recently moved to a new state. Those are the things that we can connect on. But if I am unwilling to engage in a conversation with you, I miss those opportunities. I shared this story earlier around my dad. So I remember growing up hearing a story of he was in the Marine Corps, and when he came back from for leave, went to his hometown, and he brought a friend home who lived, a couple of counties over in Georgia, and it was a black man. And my grandparents at first were like, he's not allowed in the house. But through conversation, they found out that this particular individual's father was a sharecropper with my grandfather. So there was this commonality that came, and then they invited him in the house and they got to know him, and it became a great experience for them. Now, I hate to say that it took that connection for them to even want to invite him in the house, but given the time and given the circumstances, that's where they were at. And they could have missed that opportunity had they not leaned into that connection of, let me go beyond the skin color and learn about who you are as a person.
Wow, wow. Interesting, interesting, interesting. Going beyond the skin color and learning about somebody else. I think one of the things that is really important that you talked about during your TEDx talk was self-awareness.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to actually know how self-awareness fits into the whole situation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do you think we can use self-awareness to create a better movement, so to say, so that more people can be interested in this kind of conversation?
Yeah. I think self awareness is a key that unlocks a lot of doors because ultimately, the only thing that I can control in life is how I show up in situations. And managing that and understanding that is critical to me, either approaching things as a threat or viewing them as an opportunity. So it starts with me having this understanding of I have a model of the world. And, as coaches, we talk about this kind of my perspective, my client's perspective. And as a coach, what I want to do is unlock the commonality and stay away from using my perspective to influence their experience. So I really have to work in this space of self awareness going, what am I learning about myself in any interaction that I have? And I think about my journey, and it was that model of self awareness that allowed me to go, wait a second, why do I feel the tendency, if we, kind of talk about this concept of unconscious bias, right? So noticing that when I'm in a certain area of town, I feel safe, but the minute I cross over into another area of town, there's just this underlying feeling of, I don't think I'm safe anymore. And I really had to challenge myself and go, where does that come from? And what I realized is growing up, there was this joke that would take place of, yeah, don't go to the other side of town. Right. And that became embedded into who I was. And I had to wrestle with that going, there's no other evidence than a belief that was created when I was a child about those people. And you can insert whoever they are, right? That's not just a color thing, but anybody that was different meant danger. So I had to really wrestle with that and come to terms with it in myself to go, why is that a thing that I think? And as I did that self awareness, I like to use the analogy of holding up the mirror and looking back at myself to learn how I'm showing up. So that journey of self awareness has really helped me think differently in the way I show up and allowed me to go, wait a second, this reaction that I'm having that causes me not to want to engage with this person, not to want to lean into the discomfort of this conversation. That's not about the other person. That's solely about me and the beliefs I have related to this interaction. So the more we look inward to see who we are and why we're showing up the way we do, the more opportunity it gives us to dive into more meaningful and deep conversations.
Wow, wow, interesting, interesting. So, after being self-aware, the next thing is to try to have conversation. And one of the things that I've seen that is the problem, and has been the problem, or could still be the problem, is the fact that when you try to have conversation with people around diversity, equity, and inclusion, some people will say, "Well, the society has moved past this. This is not something that we're supposed to be talking about anymore." What do you tell such people, and where is such notion coming from that we've talked about it in the past, we don't have to talk about it anymore, even though we all know that it's still a problem?
Yeah. It's interesting. I heard you in the question say, "What do you tell people?" And for the longest time in my journey, especially when I kind of first decided that I was going to embrace this concept of being an advocate and an ally in the DEI space in all kind of areas, I found myself trying to tell people how to show up in this space because my thought, if I'm being fully transparent, is, hey, knowing where I came from, knowing the beliefs that I grew up with, if I can do this and I can lean in, it shouldn't be hard for anyone. So it was almost this cavalier attitude around, I'm going to go fix everybody who believes differently than me. And that has just as negative of an impact as the beliefs that I grew up and operated in, where can't we all just get along and I don't see color and those things, because on the other end, telling someone to do something is never effective.
Mhm.
What is effective is engaging in the conversation, asking the questions. I'm a big fan of the show Ted Lasso, and there's a scene where he's in the pub and he's playing darts, and he talks about a quote where Walt Whitman said, "It's impossible to be both curious and judgmental at the same time." And that is so true. And what I found was, for me in my early journey around this stuff, is I shift my judgment. I shift my judgment from judging people who were different than me to judging people who thought differently about those people who were different than me. Um, and what I realized is I wasn't getting anywhere in conversations. I wasn't able to have meaningful conversations that could hopefully allow someone to have a different perspective. But when I shifted and started asking questions to those people, so if we use your example of, haven't we moved past this? Instead of going, no, you got to see that they're like, George Floyd just happened a few years ago, and all of these examples, right? There's sources we can prove the case that that's not true. But instead of trying to come and prove something, ask the question and say, well, what do you think? What has your experience been as to how you think it has shifted and how we have moved past it? Because then I get a little bit of insight into their experience and their perspective. Because the reality is, if you grow up, I mean, we have media now, so we can see things more than we could when I was growing up. But I think about growing up in my town, I knew what I knew based off of my experiences. And in my experiences, we had a few kids who were ethnically diverse and they got along with us and we got along with them. It's like, oh, everything's great. Racism is dead. It was kind of a thought that I had growing up. But once I expanded and saw different experiences for different people, and maybe the overt racism was dead in the moment, but there were still underlying issues and microaggressions that were taking place that I had no awareness of until I leaned in and started hearing the stories of other people. And I think it's critical to call out too that while we are talking about the dynamics of race, there are other diverse issues that are just as important, right? Think about women and people with disabilities and the LGBTQ community, right? Some of those things are less visible on the front end, but still have such an impact into the person's experience. And that's where that idea of curiosity comes in. It's like, how can I get to know you as an individual so that I can find that common ground, right? We talked about earlier this, we're drawn to people like us. Well, if I'm embracing curiosity and I'm leaning in to learn about you, I can find similarities and I can get to know you as an individual. And then we can break through some of those barriers that still exist around these diverse issues.
Yeah, wow. This is really interesting. Very interesting. One of the things that I find also very interesting in your TEDx talk was the fact that when we talk about biases, with the thing that we have going on in our head and the things that we do, some of them we're not even aware of them. We're not aware at all. And the question is, when we talk about unconscious bias, if we're not conscious about it, how do we resolve it?
Yeah, I think that is the question, right? How do I fix something I know nothing about? And that's where self-awareness comes back into the conversation, right? Because if I'm actively doing the work to learn about myself, some of those things are going to surface just organically in the work that I'm doing around self-awareness. And other times it takes a conversation with someone else. The tool that I introduced in my TED talk around this was the Johari window. And I love this as an example of um, really working through your unconscious bias, because there's four areas that we focus on. You have the arena area, which is, that's known to me and it's known to others. So we're very aware that these beliefs or these behaviors are happening. I see it, other people around me see it. But then if we move down into the second part of the quadrant, that's the facade. I'm aware of it, but I don't want anybody else to be aware of it. So I hide those tendencies, whether it's intentional or unintentional. I'm masking those particular behaviors. Then if we go up into the third part of the quadrant, that's the blind spot. And that's where other people are keenly aware that I'm showing up this way. It's just blind to me. I don't know that I'm doing this. And then the fourth quadrant that we talk about is the unknown. Other people don't know it. I don't know it. It truly is that unknown area. So the goal should be to get all of our biases to surface into the arena. So then I can do work around that. right? And every time I facilitate a training around the Johari window, I ask the question, where would you want your biases to land if you could put them anywhere in these quadrants? And most people will say the facade. And the reason they say that is a safety mechanism. It's, I want to be aware of it so I can fix it, but I don't want anybody else to know that it's there. And there's an issue with that approach. At least I'm aware of it. But when no one else is aware of it, I can't be checked on it. Right? I can think I'm doing the right things and leaning in and doing the work, but if no one else is aware to give me feedback and to have honest conversations with me, I may be missing the mark. It goes back to the I don't see color conversation, right? I don't think anyone starts off that conversation of I don't see color with ill intent. I think they truly say, can't we all just get along? We don't need to see color. We need to be the human race. That's a well-intended comment, but has so many negative implications because of a lack of awareness. So if I move that belief into the arena, then I can have other people go, here's the problem with that statement. And it's only then that I can learn from that particular issue, right? So if we're operating in that facade, we want to bring, and it's not everybody, right? I'm not going to go on. I mean, I'm doing this live, so maybe I am, but I'm not going to go on and say, you know, my grandfather was a member of the Klan. And I'm not going to broadcast that in a way to have people, you know, have that conversation, but I want to let people around me know here's how I grew up and here's the belief system that unintentionally was passed on to me, right? My grandfather passed away when I was really young, so I didn't have him influencing me in a lot of ways, but that underlying belief system certainly showed up in different avenues of my life. And unless I'm willing to lean into that with other people who can challenge some of those beliefs that I may be even unaware of, I'm never going to move past it. So moving into that arena from the facade is welcoming people in, but there has to be trust. There has to be this connection with, I know if I share this with you, you have my best interest. And sometimes the best interest is challenging me in a way that makes me uncomfortable. Right. I think Brene Brown says it best when she says clear is kind. And in that kindness, I'm being very clear about how your behaviors or your microaggressions, right? Those kind of underlying ways you show up are negatively impacting others. And we're going to have that tough conversation. But I can't have that conversation with people I don't trust. So I have to really lean into that space of trust to be comfortable moving that to the arena. Then on the blind spot, right? That's where I don't know about it. And the only way I'm going to become aware of those things that I am unaware of is going back to my circle of trust and allowing folks to give me feedback. If I'm going through this life where I'm like, oh, I embrace feedback, but the minute someone says, hey, maybe you should do this differently, I shut them down, they're no longer going to want to share that feedback with me. So I have to operate. And it goes back to that self-awareness, right? That emotional intelligence of how am I showing up when I receive feedback, and leaning in and being that person that is continually curious so that when someone says, you need to do this differently, or Jeremy, are you aware of the impact that that statement had on me? My instant response to that, if I'm not thinking and being intentional, is to be reactive, right? Well, I didn't mean anything by it. You should understand you know me, you should understand my intention. But I had someone tell me one time, and this really, you know, changed my perspective, is intention doesn't overcome impact. So my intention can be the best in the world, but the impact to you can be negative, and I have to be willing to embrace that impact. I use the example when I'm facilitating this conversation is, you know, Tolu, if I walk by, so if we're in the same room and I walk by and I accidentally step on your foot and you respond with, man, that really hurt, Jeremy. Mm-hmm. And my reaction to you is, hey, why don't you get over it? I didn't mean to step on your foot. You're going to think I'm a jerk, and rightfully so, because if I do something to cause you physical pain, my response shouldn't be, well, I didn't mean to. My response should come from a place of empathy where I lean in and say, oh, I am so sorry. I wasn't aware that your foot was there. Forgive me. Is there anything I can do to make this better for you? Right. So instead of defending myself, I lean into empathy to find out if you're okay. And when it comes to these offenses that come from our behaviors, that come from microaggressions, that stem from bias, I should want to show up the same way. If someone says, ouch, that offended me, instead of leaning into, oh, you can't say or do anything in today's society, everybody's offended by everything. Okay, but let's have a conversation about where the offense came from. What's going on in their life outside of this momentarily small interaction that I'm having that causes them to feel that particular way? Because sure, I didn't intend to make them feel any kind of way, but I can't say anything to the history of that same offense happening over and over and over again for that individual. So in the blind spot, I have to be willing to receive that feedback and be willing to make the effort to do the work in order to change. And that's the thing, I have to make the effort, because I think sometimes when we talk about this broader issue of how do we fix systemic issues of racism and sexism and homophobia that are really present, we tend to go to the offended and say, tell me what I can do differently. Right? Tell me how I can treat you differently. If you're saying the issue around race is this, how do I show up differently for you? It is not the job of the oppressed, and I said this in the TED Talk, it's not the job of the oppressed to tell the oppressor how to fix the system that's oppressing them. It's up to me. I have to do the work. I have to lean in and learn and grow and educate myself and have conversations with people that look like me and saying, how can we fix the system? Right? And give voice to those and give space to those who may not typically have space in certain areas. Invite them in, ask them to share, give them the platform, give them the spotlight, right? It's not the Jeremy show. And I think even in this, like, one of the challenges I've had around this is, what is truly my space? Because the last thing I want to ever do is come across as performative. Right. And I think it's really easy to say, oh, well, here's the white man talking about diversity. But my goal isn't to give myself the platform. My goal is to allow people to look like me, to see and hear things that might challenge them to think differently. And I'm always intentional. And here's the thing, reality is, right, if we're talking about this transparency that's required to work through the Johari window, I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to show up in a way that's more problematic than it is helpful. I get that. But in those moments, what I have to do is challenge myself that when someone says, hey, that didn't land well, embrace the feedback and go, heard, I will change. I will learn, and I will do different next time. And that's how we move from the blind spot into the arena. And then we go down to that fourth quadrant, which is the unknown. If I don't know it and you don't know it, how do we make it known? It's through education. It's through experience. It's through my ability to have conversations with people who don't look like me, don't think like me, and engage in a meaningful way to learn and use that concept of self-awareness after those conversations to reflect and say, what did I take away from that conversation? What can I think about differently going forward? And that's going to open the door for me to think differently and probably uncover some areas of bias that I did not know I had.
Wow, interesting, interesting. So there's something I'm making sure I'm trying to get it very clearly in your explanation. So you're saying that for the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it should be more of the white people coming out and say that we are interested in fixing this. We're going to talk about this. This is what we're going to do. Than for the black or the colored people like us coming out and say, well, Black Lives Matter. And I think that's why you were talking about something about the sticker, like just having the sticker Black Lives Matter alone, that cannot solve the problem. But because the major thing is people that are on the other side, the white people coming out and say, well, I think we understand what the problem is. Let's start conversation about this so that we can see what we can do. But then, so my question is now, how do you create a movement on that side without people actually coming out and say, well, Black Lives Matter and putting something on their windscreen or anywhere? So how do you encourage people from that side, people from your side, to start a conversation and kind of get out more people to have conversation around this without protesting, so to say?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and, right? Because I think about with, the deeply hurtful and unfortunate thing that happened with George Floyd that caused our society to go, wait a second, do we need to have a conversation? Thus resulting in what we saw as the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest and the conversation. And while those things are happening to generate awareness of something that should have been made, we should have been keenly aware of that well before that incident, right? It's something that was very unfortunate that caused the conversation to surface. Without people raising the issue, it could have always been this underlying thing. So I'm not saying that, people of color should never vocalize their concerns. What I say is when those concerns are vocalized, that our response shouldn't be, but don't all lives matter? And that seemed to be the pushback. And I think that pushback truly came from this, can't we all just get along, right? Some people were probably very ill-intended in the way they responded, but some people were probably going, but yeah, we should all just get along. And it should be that we are all connected. And they missed the opportunity to understand why people of color felt the need to vocalize, hey, we matter, because it really at the heart of it doesn't feel like we do. And then in spaces where I have a voice, sharing my perspective and going, yeah, we need to honor this and we need to hear from people who are different than us, right? The one thing I would never want to do is go into the space of a group of people who are protesting and having a conversation and trying to bring awareness and dictate how they should do that. That is not Jeremy's place. Jeremy's place is when I'm with my friends, when I'm having conversations that could easily be passed off as, oh, the comment about those people, and I'll use that again because it transcends just people of color, but anytime a negative comment is made because those people aren't present, it's very easy to stay silent. It's very easy to kind of chuckle at the joke and move on with my life because there's no real impact to me. And those are the moments that I have to show up. Those are the moments that I have to challenge because, again, it goes back to what's in my control and what's outside of my control. And changing the world overnight is totally outside of my control. But what I can change is the influence I have with the people I'm surrounded by. And I can show up well in those spaces and I can say, hey, I get why you might think that's a joke, but here's the impact. And I'm not sure if you're aware of that impact. And then when I do have the opportunity from a broader scale, depending on the position I have in organizations and events and that type of thing, giving voice, right? If there's an opportunity for me to share a conversation, but there's someone else who could do it better and speak from real experience, maybe I take the back seat in that moment and I say, nope, I don't want the spotlight, put it on someone else. And that's also a challenge because in this world of likes and social media and all that, we're all trying to gain this exposure and get noticed. But if I'm really trying to do the work in a meaningful way, it's not about me being noticed. It's about the change that can take place. And in order to effectively make that change, I have to realize that sometimes as a white man, my best role is to sit back and be quiet.
Good, good, good. So, excuse me. There's something that is very connected to what you just said now. During your TED talk, you said, "Well, there's times you have to actually recognize the person that built the table, and after you recognize the person, you break down the table and start up afresh." I remember you said
Yeah.
that during your TED talk. What do you really mean about that, and what are the chances of that actually happening?
Yeah, that's the ultimate question. What are the chances of that happening? Because the reason I said that is because I've heard so many times from well-meaning people, we've got to give them a seat at the table, them being anyone who is underrepresented. And I think the intent behind that's great. But what I also see happening time after time is they might have a spot at the table, but the system that prevents them from truly showing up and bringing their whole self to that space and being able to really actively drive change in that space still holds them back, even if they're there. It's like you're at the table, but I still want you to sit there silently, is almost the dynamic that takes place. So in those moments, we've got to tear down the entire table and rebuild so that it's not set up that it's the underrepresented folks at the table. It's we are all coming together to build this new table that is truly creating equity for us all.
Yeah.
And
So
I
it's
think, that's the work, right? That's the thing that's not going to happen overnight. But I think more and more, if people are willing to lean into the uncomfortable conversations, willing to talk through their own biases and how the way they think, the way they show up might impact someone from a career. So if we're talking about career and kind of that corporate environment, sometimes my beliefs, if I'm your manager, will dictate your ability to advance in your career, whether I know it or not. Right. And these microaggressions, these underlying beliefs, because maybe I have a belief that women really shouldn't be in the workplace and they should be more caregivers and home takers. And because of that belief, I might not give you an opportunity to advance. Or at the very least, maybe my thought is, well, what if you decide to have kids? And because of the way society has shaped the family dynamic, when a woman is presented with having kids, that we perceive that as a negative impact to her career. But when a man has kids, oh, he'll be fine. He needs the promotion because he's got to provide for his family. Right. So challenging even some of those beliefs is what I meant by tearing the table down and rebuilding.
wow, 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 wow. This is very interesting. There's something that you said that I think, in my own opinion, actually clarify the difference between diversity and inclusion.
Yes.
We're very good at diversity, and companies, schools, you see the website, they put a few black people here and there, and they make it look like, oh, it's a diverse environment. We have some black people here, we have people of color there. But then when you talk about sitting at the table and having opportunity to talk and say something that people will take seriously, that's where the inclusion comes in. That's where, even though there could be a few people that are there that are people of color, but then do they really want to hear these people speak? Do you really do? Is your feedback really important to
Yeah.
the conversation and things like that?
Yeah, as I think about this diversity, equity, inclusion, and then even belonging has been added to that conversation. It's diversity is all around us. We can't escape diversity. You put more than two people, more than one person in a room, there's diversity there, right? We are all different. So we can't stop at the idea that, yeah, we're all different, because in that difference comes that belief sometimes that one group is better than the other if we stop at diversity. But if we lean into creating inclusion and equity, right, that then generates, not only are you different, but you have a unique perspective that I need. And I need to hear from you to shape the way I show up because it is different than mine. Right.
Mhm.
Jeremy's opinion about how the world works is one opinion, and it may not be right in a lot of ways. So I have to continually surround myself with different people to hear different perspectives so I can have a broader understanding of how the world works. I can't do it on my own. I think the analogy I heard someone say is, if we're thinking about DEI, so inclusion is, hey, I'm including you, I'm inviting you to the party, but we can't stop there. We've got to create equity. And I've been to parties before where, I spent my time up against the wall nursing my drink because I didn't really feel like I belonged there. I was at the party, I was included, but I didn't necessarily know my place. So then I've included you, but how do we make it equitable? Well, equitable is bringing you out on the dance floor and me going to you saying, hey, come dance with us. But then we can take it a step further and generate this sense of belonging. And instead of just inviting you on the dance floor, I go to you and say, hey, what song do you want to hear? Because I'm not going to shape this party for just me. I want you to feel like you belong. So I want to play music that lands for you well. And that's how we move from just, yeah, we understand diversity, but how are we creating this sense of belonging for the people that are here? And here's the deeper part of this: who's not here? Who should be in this room that isn't? And how do we become aware of that? It's through those conversations. It's through getting to know from other people's perspectives who is a critical voice in what we're trying to do, and then inviting those people in as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm very happy that you said the last part is playing the music that the person wants to hear, and now say, well, now that we're enjoying ourselves, right? Who is supposed to be here that's not here? And I think one of the ways that they've been trying to do that is to have programs to support diversity so that they can call people in. And one of the ways I've been able to get into where I've worked in the past and still working is because of programs for diverse population. And now it's very sad to now seeing some of this program being taken away because of so many reasons I don't understand as a person.
Yeah,
But then
sure.
so it appears that that sense of saying, well, I think we're in the party, we're enjoying ourselves. The music is being played. Everybody likes the music. Everyone's music is coming out one after the other. It's not just one from one culture. But then we're saying, oh, who can come and enjoy themselves? And we can call people. But it seems that that's been taken away. I don't understand why. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean that's getting to that big broader picture of why we're moving the way we're moving and some societal impacts. I think though from my perspective it goes back to that feeling as if this is a threat, right? Perceiving this as a threat of what might I lose if we start bringing more people into the conversation. And if we can move away from viewing that inclusion, equity, belonging as a threat and see it as an opportunity to hear more voices and an opportunity to gain different perspective, it might allow us to show up differently. I like the analogy of standing and watching a baseball game from outside, right? So if you imagine a big wooden fence at a baseball game. And for me, being 6 foot tall, if the fence is 5'5", I'm golden. I can see the game, no problem. I can walk up to the fence, I see the game uninhibited. But if I have someone who's 5 foot tall come up and try to watch the game, they're not going to be able to see. And bringing them in and creating a sense of equity for them and a sense of belonging for them, I'm going to bring up a stool that allows them to step up on that stool and see the game. And me taking that effort to give them that space so they can see and enjoy the game does not diminish my ability to see the game. But instead of viewing it in that way of me helping you have access to this takes away my access, or me helping you have access to this creates space for you, I view it as the minute I give you that opportunity, it takes it away from me. So it's almost this, we view it as a pie, right? If I make your size of the pie bigger, it makes my pie smaller. But in reality, we have an endless size pie. We just got to make it big enough for everyone to be able to belong.
Wow, wow, interesting, interesting. Which is gonna make me ask about something that we all know it's a big thing. Being pulled over by the police. Right.
Yeah.
As for you as an example, if you get pulled over by the police, what kind of what are the type of emotions that go through your mind, your body? And does it matter to you whether the person is a white police or black police? How do you feel?
I was raised to respect authority in a lot of ways, and I think that just comes my dad was in the military. So for me, when I get pulled over, my biggest concern has always been, oh, what are my parents going to do? As a teenager, right? Because that's when I got most of my tickets for speeding. It was like, oh God, what are my parents going to do when I get home and tell them I got a speeding ticket? That was the most fear that entered my mind, and it didn't matter who was on the other side of that. That's where my fear was. And for the longest time, because that's how I was raised, and that's the belief that I had with any type of law enforcement or authority, I thought, yeah, if you just show up and do what you're supposed to do, it'll be fine. I don't understand why people fear the cops. Truly, that was the belief I had. But through conversation, through willingness to hear different perspectives, I began to see things differently. I have a very close friend who shares an interaction where he was coming on. I think I'll talk about this in the TED Talk. Um, he was heading off to college, I believe, and or coming home from, because he had his backpack in the vehicle, and he was driving his dad's car, and he gets pulled over, and it was a seamless stop, but the officer became very aggressive because he was a Latino man, and he was treating him very differently than anything I'd ever experienced when I got pulled over for, speeding or doing something very, 75 and a 25 speed zone, right? Those kinds of extremes of why I justifiably got pulled over. He didn't. They ran the tags and thought that maybe he was someone that he shouldn't have been. And that created this aggressive moment where they pulled him out of the vehicle and, really made him fear the situation. And as he was telling me that story, I realized in that moment, that's something Jeremy has never experienced, but I cannot discount what he experienced. So because of my experience, this belief that if you respect authority and do what you're supposed to, everything is going to be fine, it shattered in that moment because I know my friend. I know that he wouldn't show up in any type of aggressive way that, people tend to perceive. Well, if you hadn't resisted, you would be fine. That's not always the case. That's not always the reality for some. And I think it goes back to what we started with this. We live in two different Americas in a lot of ways.
Wow, interesting, interesting. I mean, one of the things that I also find very interesting in your TED talk is the fact that the way our brain respond to such situation, the response that
Yeah.
we give to such situation, our brain, like you said, and like I know because I also have a basic knowledge of biology, that we tend to move towards comfort. Our brain tends to bring us to be in a situation of comfort, and we try to move away from anything that is discomfort to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as a result of that, there's also another study that is saying that when people experience discrimination, the brain gut region changes such
Mm.
that it's easy for somebody to now move into their shell, and they don't want to interact very well anymore because they've experienced discrimination and things like that. So my question is, what would you recommend in a work environment like that somebody experienced discrimination? How, based on your experience working in the bank
Mm-hmm.
sector, how had people treated such situation? What was the resolution such
Yeah.
that it doesn't just shut down somebody? And when somebody shut down like that, I mean, if the brain is shutting down and they're not going to perform at their best anymore, and then of course if the person of color is going to come back and, oh, they all do drugs anyways, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why they're not doing their job very well. So
Yeah.
in that kind of situation, what would you recommend?
Yeah, and I'll speak from my experience kind of in as a coach in these spaces. One of the things I found when I coach across difference, the times that I've had really powerful coaching engagements is when I start off the conversation acknowledging the difference and saying, hey, if we're coaching in a coaching engagement, totally what I would say is, hey, I recognize I'm a white man, you're a black man, and you have very different experiences than I do through your career, through your life. And I want to honor those. I may not fully understand everything that you're going through, but I want you to have space to talk through that. And I want you to feel the safety to share those things. And as we move forward, as you share, I'm not going to object to your experience. I'm going to lean in and hear and understand and operate from this place of empathy. So that's kind of the personal how I would approach that. And then from a broader perspective, I think it goes into creating psychological safety for people to be able to call out those issues. Hey, this happened and it makes me feel this way. And culturally within organizations, if the environment dictates that when that is brought up, that they're dismissed, people aren't going to bring those things up. So we have to work within our culture to create that real sense of safety for people to be able to bring up those issues and know that they will be addressed in a meaningful way to prevent those microaggressions from taking place that thus causes people to feel a lack of safety, thus impacting their belonging in the organization.
Wow, interesting, interesting. So I want to talk about the very exceptional situation that says that, well, good people say or do the wrong thing. For example, the example that you
Sure.
gave, about you walking by and mistakenly stepping on my foot, and because you think you know who I am or I know who you are, you just say, well, your response immediately sometimes might not be sorry, because you think I know you, and I should know that you're not doing that intentionally, that kind of a thing. I think that happens a lot. So in situation whereby once somebody did something once in a lifetime and they're being put in a box as a result of just one time thing that they did, which is not who they are. How do you think that those should be addressed? Because
Yeah. Yeah, I mean there's a whole conversation happening around cancel culture right now, right?
yeah.
And I don't want to speak to every situation because I think there's uniqueness in every situation. I think there has to be accountability for people's actions. There does. And for the longest time in our society, I don't think that happened for certain people, right? I think some people were held overly accountable for certain actions, and then other people got away with all kinds of things and never held accountable. So there's almost this pendulum shift of correcting that in some ways. And I'm not discounting those efforts. Hold people accountable for the things that they do. But you said something that I thought was important where good people can sometimes do perceived bad things.
Mhm.
I would flip that and say sometimes bad people do good things. And that's a challenge, right? So instead of going back to that quote I used earlier, you can't be both curious and judgmental. Try, and this is situational, to remove the judgment in those moments to really understand what is the situation. And based off of the behaviors, there has to be accountability, but also recognize that I'm not going to judge your entire life over one thing. I'm going to lean in, I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm going to engage in this moment. And there will be consequences for the actions that took place, yet I'm not going to allow myself to shortcut because you did this one thing that I don't like to say, oh, you're ultimately bad or you're ultimately good. I think there's this let's view the situation for what it is. Let's hold people accountable for what they did. But let's also recognize we're humans and we make mistakes and we grow, and that is how we move forward, I think, as a society, even to allow people the grace to grow. But if they're given the grace to grow, we also have to see action that they're actually trying to grow.
Wow, wow, interesting, interesting. This has been very educative for me, learning different types of things and things that we can be doing differently to help people to understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about. So now that we've all agreed that it's very important to start a conversation from whoever is available, most importantly from the side of the people that are not being oppressed, people that are doing the oppression. That's what we said, right? So it's more effective to start the conversation from there, regardless of what the situation is. So my question now is for people who have realized that, well, this is not a good situation, but they've been trying to be silent about it. And we want to move them from apathy to advocacy. That advocacy means that they have to publicly say something. Like we having a conversation like this, it's not heavy. There's so many of my group, your group, that probably don't want to have a conversation in a public space like this. And if they're not doing that, that means there's no advocacy. Right. So
Mhm.
how would you how would you recommend, or what would you recommend to encourage such people to just not be silent about it? So don't think
Yeah.
when somebody make a joke about a black person's culture, somebody from people of color group culture, and you say, "Oh, that's funny," and all you do is laugh about it. But we're trained to say that. Is it possible to not just laugh about it? Come out and say, "Well, though that's funny the way you said it, but that's not the right thing to do. That's actually that's actually making these people from this particular group to feel bad, and of course, taking that context to the work environment, they won't be able to perform at their best. So, how would you encourage such person to just not be silent and just laugh at the joke, but be able to come out and say, "Well, let's create a movement. This is not good. How can we fix it?"
Yeah. I'll speak from my own experience. The thing I learned is I have to be very comfortable being uncomfortable. And these aren't easy topics to talk about. These aren't comfortable topics to talk about, right? It's hard for me as a white man to hold up that mirror and go, even though I've tried to be a well-intended good person throughout my life, like I want to be a good human. And I'm also having to recognize that sometimes, because of my biases, because of my upbringing, because of all of this, there are characteristics and behaviors that are in me that I have to actively challenge day in and day out. And that's not a comfortable thing to do. I want to go through life thinking I'm great and everybody loves me and I love everybody and it's awesome. Yet sometimes my behaviors might negatively impact someone else. So I have to be willing to lean into that discomfort and not shy away from it. And that helps me engage in those tough conversations.
Good, 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 good. Excellent. Thank you so much. So this should be my last major question for today.
Yes.
And in your TED talk, you said something about expanding the constellation of input.
Mm-hmm.
Expanding the constellation of input. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, it goes back to that being comfortable, being uncomfortable. It's leaning into the spaces that you may not have a comfort around, right? I talk about in the TED Talk my work with different business resource groups and different careers that I've had. And at first, my reaction to that is, oh, I'm a white guy. I don't belong in those spaces. But by having conversations and leaning in and hearing people are like, no, we want your voice. We want that advocate. We want that ally to be here. And I started engaging and I expanded from what was kind of this, circle of people who look and thought like I did to bringing in people of difference in my inner circle. Not just we're acquaintances and we work together, but these are people that I trust. I'm not going to make a decision without going to certain people now. And because I was willing to expand my constellation of input, those people look and think a lot differently than I do now. 10 years ago they didn't. 10 years ago it was just a almost an echo chamber of Jeremy's belief system that, yeah, dude, tell me I'm right. you know but now when I have conversations, I'll say, challenge me, help me think differently, because I know I'm getting different perspectives.
Wow, wow. Okay. Okay. I think I understand what that is now. Thank you so much. We are wrapping up the session now. And thank you so much, our guest today, Jeremy May. It's been so much fun learning from you, from your experiences, and from your knowledge. So I want to ask you at this point, any last thoughts for our viewers? Any last message you want to give to them? Something that you really wanted to say, I didn't give you opportunity to say?
Yeah, I'll share a quick story if we have time. It's just an old anecdote, and I love it, and I think it ties well to this conversation. The story goes, and some of the listeners may have heard it, but there's this young person walking down the beach after a bad storm, and there's all these starfish that have washed up on the shore, and the kid is bent down and throwing these starfish back in the ocean, and this person's watching and seeing this kid go about this action, and finally goes over to the kid and says, "Hey, you realize you can't save every starfish and you can't make that big of a difference." And the kid ignores the person and leans down, picks up another starfish and throws it back in the ocean and said, "I made a difference to that one." So going back to this conversation of, I can't change the world overnight, but what I can do is have a difference in the people that I interact with. So my challenge to all of us is think about how we can show up in our circles to make that difference, lean into the discomfort, be willing to have the tough conversations, and always, always, always act from a place of curiosity and not judgment.
Good, good. Thank you so much. And this is an exciting time. I wish we could just keep going on and keep learning from you, but we can't do that because we want to release you to go and do some other more important stuff because we know you're a very busy person. Thank you for taking out some time in your busy schedule to be here today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. I see you next time, our viewers. Have a nice one.